Welcome back to Language of the Soul, conversations on healing and growth. I'm Ben Umstead.
And I'm Martin Perkins. Let me do that again. And I'm Martin Perkins. And I'm Martin Perkins. I'm Martin Perkins. I like that last one. I'm Martin Perkins.
Can you do it that way again, just for a little bit more space?
Yeah. I'm Martin Perkins.
So it's quite hilarious. Beginning the show today, we did multiple takes of our intro, and I think that's incredibly delicious considering that the beginning point of our episode is talking about our performative culture that we live in, the differences, the discernments that we can make around performative and performance. And ultimately, when exploring our depths, what does it feel like to be authentic and trustworthy in a performative world?
Being trustworthy in a performative world is, at initial glance, it feels a little bit like a Zen cone.
What's a Zen cone?
So a Zen cone is a thought puzzle designed to bring us to our depths. In other words, the deliciousness of a Zen cone is that there really isn't a single answer that exists at the level of the thinking mind. But as we dig deeper and we explore the deeper meaning of what it means in whatever context that the cone might be presenting, we're encouraged to really step out of our own box, to really focus on for what for us, what's real. And at a certain level, that's at the very crux of this podcast, which is if our interest lies in being trustworthy in what from my sensibilities is an undeniable fact that the world is become ever increasingly performative. And so what does that word performative even mean? Right? So, on the one level, you could say, well, performative behavior can be defined as an action taken specifically with an audience in mind to elicit a response. And at the surface, what harm does there lie in that, right? People have performed since the beginning of time, right?
It's human nature. Yeah.
Right. Humanity is sat in large rooms, large spaces, whether it be around a fire or around a stage, and we've performed dance and music. It often brings us to the very depths of our being, this notion of the creative bringing us to the depths of our being, that we can, through the performance, access something that's deeply soulful within us. But what happens when the performance isn't really about accessing soulfulness? It's really about one thing, tricking us into doing what that particular entity, that person, that organization wants us to do, right? And on a certain level, the performative nature that exists through the internet today really has its roots in early radio and TV. Early radio and TV, we all remember, well, some of us remember.
I can say I did grow up listening to the radio and radio dramas in the 1990s.
Yeah. Early radio and TV had amazing performances by people, amazing singers, amazing actors, voice actors doing really beautiful stuff. And yet, if the one consistent aspect to those performances was the ad. So whether we're talking about I Love Lucy in the 1950s or MASH in the 70s, the one consistent piece throughout all those decades is the ad. What's being sold to us? What are we willing to compromise for the sake of what's being sold to us, right? And at a certain point, this changes, intrinsically changes the nature of the performance. And I think there's been a steady progression so that the performance has become less and less about the deeper meanings of life and become more and more a kind of gelling between what's being sold and the performance itself, to the point now where they're one and the same in the form of, on social media, of influencers, various TV shows where everything in the show itself is a sales product. It's, we see these home improvement shows, and everything on there is some version of some product that's being sold, right? I'll believe these home improvement shows when all they're selling is recyclable products, right? When all they're doing is going, how do I reuse this lumber that got ripped off of my deck? Or how do I reuse, I don't know, propane tanks? Turn them into shelf units or whatever it might be, right? When it becomes that, then I'll believe in the essence of what's being offered. Now, that's based on my aesthetic, right? I'm very much about reusing materials. It's what I love to do. I love reusing materials to make things. So that speaks directly to my aesthetic. But this notion of the product and the performance becoming one and the same, it brings everything to a very superficial level. It brings into question, is the performance trustworthy? And to what degree are we just being sold something? Or are we selling some part of ourselves by participating in the viewing of whatever it might be, right? I want to say early on in, I want to say it's maybe the third, fourth, or fifth episode of 30 Rock. Tina Fey explores this beautifully when Baldwin's character, in essence, wants to blur this line between promotion and the show itself, and wants, in essence, the show to become gelled with the ad itself, with the sponsors. And she resists, but in this very funny tongue-in-cheek kind of way that, we get pulled, the curtain gets pulled back, and all of a sudden we're seeing them doing these little spots for Snapple. Right in the middle of the show, they're sponsoring Snapple, and they're pulling back the curtain because they want us to see just how seamless it can be, that it can happen, and we don't even necessarily, they're purposely sort of poking fun at it, but it's there.
Hmm. Hmm.
And it's become even more seamless in the sense that we've now reached the point where we accept the idea that someone selling us as a influencer, that they're trustworthy just because they are particularly attractive or they're particularly funny, whatever it might be, or a combination of it all. But like, they basically have mastered the art of being popular on video. And the result is we are led to believe they're worthy of our trust because it's coming from the popular girl. And it really, for me, begs the question, what is the slippery slope that we go down as a culture? And how do we navigate that in our lives? Because it's in every facet. Unless we literally have cut ourselves off from all forms of media, it's there.
What you're talking about reminds me of the seminal British mockumentary filmmaker, Peter Watkins. He would often talk about the Hollywood monoform and its intent on providing a performative, ad-driven space, yes, and also the monoform, the mass audio-visual form, as a beginning, middle, and end. That beginning, middle, and end structure allowed for a compact way to present advertising.
Yeah.
The idea of the presentation is really important. A synonym for performance when we were doing our research and just kind of getting our ideas together is stunt. To pull a stunt like this. And I think it really speaks to the lack of depth when the stunt is what draws you in. Whatever kind of stunt, there's different degrees of stunt. 25 years ago, we're thinking of Johnny Knoxville and the Jackass group and these kind of, debaucherous, juvenile stunts like this, pranks.
Right.
And then we think of all of the TikTok trends that transpire, really quite quickly. It's an incredibly efficient platform in the sense of the stunt being generated by people who quite often are presenting a product or presenting themselves like we're speaking of the gelling, that they are the product in that sense. Your attention is the product. And I think that's a really important aspect of what we're talking about, at least in the initial point of this conversation. Because for me, as somebody who prides themselves truly on loving storytelling, cinematic storytelling. So, film, movies, motion pictures. And we can argue that it's all cinematic now, right? We live in that video world and it's all the image, the aesthetic, and how we have our biases towards those aesthetics. The curiosity that's inherent in performance, but not necessarily performative. I want to get a sense of that from you.
So I want to share a story linked to how I started out talking about TV and radio, and that linkage I made to the notion of the ad, that the ad in many ways became the story being told consistently over time, over decades. The show changed, but the ad was consistent. The Tide commercial is just as present today as it was 60 years ago.
Yeah.
There's a writer, he describes himself as an evolutionary cosmologist, a man by the name of Brian Swimmer. And he's written a number of books. One book in particular that was resonant for me, written in 1984, is The Universe is a Green Dragon. And he talks about what he calls the cosmic creation story, right? And how he describes it is it explores the creativity that suffuses the universe. In other words, the universe itself is in essence made of creativity, creative particles. And our work is, as human beings, is to take what's there and make it our own, right? And when the performative becomes the predominant story, when the ad becomes the story, what happens to the world? What happens to our communication? What happens to the sheer possibilities in life? Just what's possible. My sense is that the performative is doing quite the number as a result of being so focused on what's being sold rather than the deeper storytelling.
Yeah.
And it's justified in many ways. It's justified by, well, we live in a capitalist society. We've got to make money off this, right? And the notion of what merchandising needs to occur, what needs to be sold. And, I get it. My Snapple is the book that I've written, the courses that I offer. I get that there's an underlying intention, but the distinction that I would draw is there a deep sense of soulful alignment, a sense of genuine calling? Is there something trustworthy in what we're sharing versus what's being thrown at us through this kind of ad-based interactive process? Because if we're interacting at all with any form of media, on some level we're being sold something. And the real question is, well, what are we being sold? What's our relationship to being sold? How are we dancing with that? What's our own storytelling around how we're interacting with it? And if you and I, if we just go to the synonyms, not the synonyms, the synonyms for authenticity, we come up with words like genuineness, originality, legitimacy, reliability, dependability, veracity, faithfulness, fidelity, credibility. I think we all could agree that those are all words that are really important in the world today, right? Whereas when we get to the synonyms for really having a tough time with that word today. The synonyms for performance, we have to really ask ourselves, where's the meaning and depth? What's the type of storytelling that we're living in, right? Because the synonyms for performance are attainment, completion, which begs the question, in what sense? What are we completing? Are we just getting the task done? Or have we brought meaning to the task? Fulfillment, again, in what sense? Or said in another way, to what end? Pursuance, appearance. Appearance of, being a tricky one because we all have our aesthetics. To what degree is it just about, oh, well, I'm biased against this, but I'm for this. Therefore, the appearance of one thing versus another gives it meaning. And that's legitimate. That's a legitimate part of any performative element. And, the word you used earlier, stunt, as it pertains to performance, because one can make the case that a great deal of what occurs in the realm of performance, it's almost like a stunt or a hook. How are we being hooked?
How are we being hooked? Yeah.
Right. So I feel like I answered the question you offered.
Yeah. It really lends itself to my experience and my mission. And I want to share that with you and our listeners today because when you bring up the synonyms for authenticity, reliability, trustworthiness, credibility, genuineness, 2 years ago, I was asked by the co-founder of the Slam Dance Film Festival, Paul Rockman, to come on board and cultivate an idea he had. He was going to hand it over to me. And within the world of independent film, there's this sense of that's where the visions come from. That's where the visionary storytellers come from, right? That's where the ideas with meaning and depth arise because money ultimately isn't the driving force in the independent world. That's changed a lot in the United States of America in terms of a lot of the films, a lot of the filmmakers that we may think of from certain points in independent cinema. Richard Linklater, even Quentin Tarantino, now he's such a household name because he has such a particular aesthetic. Paul brought this idea to me because he felt that independent film was losing sight of the depths that it often tapped into. Specifically, the Independent Spirit Awards and the Gotham Awards, which typically represent independent film, were really representing much larger movies, movies that were made for $15 million or $20 million instead of $1 million or $500,000, relatively very small amounts in the world of film budgets. So out of that, the Indie Awards was born. And being a co-founder of something that from the very beginning looked at authenticity and depth and trustworthiness within storytelling, not selling a product, but sharing an experience in order to tap into someone else's feelings, in order for them to explore their own depths. This is by and large what I think film can do, whether or not it's independently made outside of studio systems. But for me, when I stepped into this work and I was figuring out what films and filmmakers were eligible, that whole process, from day one, I told myself, and then I began telling all the filmmakers that I reached out to, this has to be a transparent process. In the world of film festivals, in the world of film financing, there's so many closed doors. So many people don't know what's going on. And that leads to a lot of anxiety and unnecessary suffering. And I said to everybody, first, we're not asking you for money. A lot of the time, You got to submit to an awards event. You have to pay upwards of $500 to submit, and you don't even know if you're going to be genuinely considered. So, right off the bat, we wanted them to garner trust in us and trust in me specifically as the main person who was communicating with them. You brought up the nature of communication. It had to be from the first email. This is not about garnering a sense of value as in image, which is a funny thing to say about film, but value as in theme, as in feeling, because ultimately that's the backbone of storytelling and particularly film as an art form. So that trustworthiness was paramount for me as I built out the indies. And this was over a year that I was communicating with some of the filmmakers, all the way up to the actual awards event where we had some of them as nominees and then winners at the Directors Guild of America in Los Angeles last December. All of these people gathered, and something happened that felt magical. Now, it felt magical because I had been on the inside of this process for 2 years. And then all of a sudden, or what felt like all of a sudden, I was in a room with several hundred people, all these filmmakers that I had been corresponding with about all the different aspects that go into creating an event like this. What happened when everyone came together? A lot of people that did not know each other, some people that knew of each other. What happened was precisely what we're talking about because I built that trustworthiness with all of them. I wanted to be reliable. I wanted to be genuine. So laying that groundwork for being reliable and trustworthy was key. But I didn't know what was going to happen on December 9th. And what happened time after time, every person who got up on stage, every filmmaker, these are storytellers, these are people who have invested sometimes their own money and invested their mission, their belief into a singular thing, this one particular story, whether it's Atikamekw Sons, which was based off of a real event with the Atikamekw indigenous community in Quebec in the 70s, or whether it was Daruma, which was a road trip buddy movie that starred two people with disabilities. All of these films were by people who really kept asking themselves every day in their process, where is my authenticity? What does that mean to me? And the result was everyone coming together in that room and everyone being in solidarity with this sense that in the age of performative culture, in the age of content, independent cinema was key in cultivating that authenticity. And what was extraordinary, where that magic came from, was this sense of what that meant to everybody across the board. Depth. Time and time again, it was depth, relaying human experience, different people from different places, from different times, and finding what that genuineness was for that person in their journey. And making sure, particularly if it was a fiction film, to cultivate this depth to where it would resonate with audiences, not because of a material product or not because of some stunt, but ultimately what I believe most storytellers and most filmmakers in particular are asking, and I'll get even more specific. Akira Kurosawa, the director of Seven Samurai, Rashomon, one of the most influential and well-renowned filmmakers. He said, I ask the same question every time I make a movie. How can we all get along better? How can we all communicate with each other more authentically? How can we all be more connected in a genuine way? And all those filmmakers up there were stating essentially the same thing. This was so potent, it was so powerful because I showed up with my mission when I was asked to come on board and create the Indie Awards, take it from an idea and actually bring it into a whole living, breathing thing. without a doubt, without a missing a beat, I said to everybody else involved, we have to be transparent. We have to be dependable. We have to show them that we trust them and admire them and see them in solidarity so that they can trust us and see us in solidarity. Because we're asking a big thing. We're saying, hey, this is a new thing. This is a brand new thing. We're experimenting. Come experiment with us. And talk about that curiosity again and that way of communication. You got to have trust there. You got to build that trust. And for me, the reason why that was so key in my mission was because of my practice and how I'm practicing within myself, right?
Yeah. That notion of depth and its interconnectivity with trustworthiness, authenticity. And, I've been teaching the Language of the Soul course for over 10 years now. And along the way, I often jokingly, it's a Seinfeld reference, and I often will say, I'm teaching a class about nothing, right? And what I'm really referencing is how important it is to access the nothingness within us. Because in truth, every performance doesn't begin nor end in a performative state. Every performance has the possibility that something can leap into existence that wasn't there. The performance can, physicists refer to it as quantum fluctuation, that creativity just arises in us, between us, in our interconnectivity. We can be creative life force itself, and that it arises to varying degrees and in a multitude, an infinite number of ways. And, when I say nothingness or emptiness, on some level, language doesn't do justice to it. Because to feel like a real connection with the nothingness of one's being, there are really no words for it. That's why there's a fun phrase that comes up in Taoism that once one speaks the Tao, it's no longer the Tao. In other words, one can know it and then it's not there. And, people who want a beginning, a middle, and an end to everything generally want to talk about creation as in that framework. But the truth is, every moment carries those qualities. And that recognition, both scientifically but also intuitively, that the emptiness of our being is the source of all that is. And that if we can allow ourselves to access that, what we're referencing here can be transformed, that there can be performance that has the depth that we're all hungering for. And that sometimes it shows up in the funniest and oddest of ways, right? Those moments in time where we can be both laughing and yet intrinsically feeling something that's extraordinarily deep and meaningful, and yet humorous at the same time, seemingly light. And on some level, that role of the absurd plays an enormous role in all this. But ultimately, what we're really talking about here is how do we relate this cultivation within ourselves to our existing aesthetic? Where do we find beauty? How do we refine that? How do we create greater depth of and connection to what's so? And how do we relate to the performative as it exists? And how do we learn to discern what really matters? And it really requires some level of practice with ourselves, knowing that, I'm not here to define what matters to you. My work with students and clients is always centered around the nature of the practice. In other words, the how versus the what. The what is purely outside of my realm. I'm not here to define what should or shouldn't matter to another, but rather, how are you practicing with it? And knowing that in doing so, as you pointed out so beautifully in your story around the Indies, it can bring a sense of community and interconnection and shared depth in ways that are extraordinary.
It's a true, true potency of trusting yourself
Right.
and sharing it with others. We just came off of the notion of the gift of conviction with our soul journaling talk. And you, as a teacher, are concerned with how are you practicing? How am I cultivating trust within myself? And I think that's really key to say within myself. The trust is going to change too. My degrees, the ways I trust myself and bring that about in the world will change within the practice. And this speaks to the quantum level of creative energy, right? The dance that happens that we all experience because we're all an expression of the universe. Boy, oh boy, do I feel like probably a lot of people don't trust themselves because they hear things like that and they go, no, no, I can't be. How could I be? What is this? It's a lot easier to put our trust in systems and religions. It's a lot easier to put our trust in snake oil salesmen.
Well, because people are looking for
An end.
an end and, frankly, a shortcut to the end. And because, well, I'm certainly not the first to say it, but it does bear repeating that the journey is what matters rather than its destination, right? So, what we're really talking about is letting go of control of the journey. Of course, it is our job to set forth the pathway. I seek to go this way, and there's nothing wrong with setting forth an end goal. But it's also our job in the midst of such a journey to let go of controlling how that path to that end shows up. All too often, humanity wants to control that path.
Hmm.
This process is not without hope. There's a great number of people doing deeply meaningful performance based work. Creativity is being, it's not just emanating all around us, but people are working with it in extraordinary ways, in playful, wonderful ways. And so that gives me great hope. And it's why we have these conversations so that we can point at those things in ourselves and in the other and go, look, it's here, right?
That's the thing. It's right here. It's right in front of us because it's always within us.
Exactly. Beautifully said. Thank you, Ben.
If you'd like to learn more about healing and growth, Tao Yin, the language of the soul, you can do so by visiting martinperkins.com. It's your little corner of the marketplace there. Over there, you can find access to acupuncture and herbal treatments, the Language of the Soul course, Language of the Soul book, available as a paperback and in an audiobook edition. And you also find our movie club. The next movie that we'll be focusing on for the club is Three Colors White. Late last summer, we watched Three Colors Blue. This is a thematic trilogy, so you don't have to watch each of the films to really know what's going on. It's all more about the larger themes of fraternity and liberty and love as a reflection through the French flag colors, blue, white, and red. So White's coming up, and you can watch that with Martin at Simplicity on Sunday, February 2nd at 7 p.m., or you can watch it on your own time. And then you can join us for a discussion via Zoom on Thursday, February 6th at 7 p.m. Martin, thank you so much for spending some time with me today and discussing what is an incredibly delicious, potent, challenging, and like you noted, extraordinarily hopeful space. That nothingness exemplifies everything.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you for the conversation.